She was nobody, a quiet archivist who memorized the location of 34,000 documents and never once raised her voice in a meeting. The kind of woman people looked past at parties. The kind of woman her ex-boyfriend left at dinner, not with a fight, not with drama, just with a glance at her plate and four words that rewrote the way she saw herself for 2 full years. She never told anyone, until one night, exhausted and tired of pretending, she whispered it to the most dangerous man in Chicago. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know that within 7 days, that man without a single threat, without a single drop of blood, would quietly dismantle everything her ex had ever built. No explosion, no confrontation, just information, placed in the right hands at the right time. That is what real power looks like. And this is a story about what happens when the most invisible woman in the room walks into the orbit of the most powerful man in the city, and neither of them is ever the same again. This channel exists for one reason. Some people are born to lead, and the lessons they carry are never taught in any classroom. This is not a channel about crime. This is a channel about mindset, about the kind of courage that operates in silence, and about the real secrets behind power that lasts. If that is the world you want to understand, you are in exactly the right place. Here's what this story will give you that you cannot get anywhere else. It will show you that the most dangerous kind of strength is the kind that never announces itself. It will show you that the people who protect quietly, act precisely, and never need credit are the ones who change everything. And it will show you that being overlooked is not a weakness. It is the beginning of a particular kind of power that most people never develop because they are too busy trying to be seen. If this story moves something in you, leave a comment below and tell me what line hit you hardest. Share this with someone who has ever been underestimated. And if you want more stories about the minds behind real power, subscribe to this channel right now because the next one is already waiting for you.
Nora Voss had memorized the location of 34,000 documents, and not one of them told her why her father had to die. That thought came to her every night around this time. 9:15. The basement of the Hargrove Institute smelling like old paper and floor wax, the fluorescent lights humming the same two notes they'd hummed for 30 years, the rest of the building empty and quiet above her. She preferred it this way, had always preferred it. Down here, nobody needed anything from her. Nobody walked past with that particular look that said, "Oh, you're just the archivist." Down here, it was only her and 34,000 documents, and in that relationship, she was the one with the authority. She was working through a donation box tonight. Lincoln Square, a demolished building, the usual end-of-life mix of things people leave behind when a place comes down. Family letters, black and white photographs, old architectural drawings from the 1940s. She moved through the stack quickly, efficiently. 6 years of this work had made her fast in ways she never talked about at parties, partly because she never went to parties, and partly because nobody at parties wanted to hear that she could date a document from 1943 by the paper weight alone. The box was almost done. She picked up the last item and stopped. To anyone else, it was a city map. Chicago, early 90s, dense with cartographic symbols and margin notes in blue ink. Standard stuff, completely ordinary. But Nora was the daughter of Edmund Voss. And Edmund Voss had spent 20 years teaching her that some maps were not about geography at all. She looked at it for 4 seconds, maybe 5. Then she folded it carefully, slid it into the inside pocket of her coat, not her bag, not her tote, her coat, the place closest to her body, and went back to work. She did not panic. That was the important thing. She assessed. She filed the information. She continued doing her job because 8 months of careful living had taught her that the most dangerous thing you could do when you found something unexpected was to let your face show it. 8 months ago, her father had been killed in what the Chicago police called a straightforward street robbery. Wallet taken, phone taken, Watch taken. Case closed in 72 hours. Too fast, Nora had thought from the moment she heard. Too clean. And when she'd arrived at his apartment 2 days later, every map he'd drawn in the last 20 years of his life was gone. Not one page, not a stray sketch, all of it. Vanished without a trace and not a single word about it in any report. She knew what that meant. She just didn't have proof. So she went to work every morning. She paid her brother Jake's tuition at MIT every month without telling him why or how. She answered her phone when people called and said she was fine when they asked and did not ask the questions that needed to be asked out loud because asking them out loud was dangerous. Careful was exhausting. Careful was also what kept Jake in school and herself out of the ground. Her colleague Dennis came through around 9:45. Good-natured guy, early 30s, the sort of well-meaning that never quite translated into actually noticing people. Dennis said, "Hey, a few of us are ordering pizza. You want in?" Nora said, "I'm good, thanks." Dennis said, "You sure? You look like you haven't eaten since this morning." Nora looked up for the first time in 20 minutes. "I ate. I just look like this." Dennis laughed. He didn't hear anything wrong in that sentence. Nora didn't either, really, not anymore. She'd said some version of it often enough that it had become automatic. A small shield, just enough to stop the conversation before it went somewhere she didn't have the energy for tonight. When he turned away, she watched him for a moment. Just a moment. He was walking back toward the light and the warmth and the ordinary world, where the last item in a donation box was always what it looked like. She let herself feel the weight of not living in that world for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned back to the documents. At 5 minutes to 9, she carried a box from the stacks to the reading room upstairs and found the room was not empty. A man at the table near the door, navy wool sweater, dark-framed glasses, a notebook open in front of him. He looked like a professor working late, and nothing about that picture was alarming until she started noticing the things around him. Phil, the building guard, 60 years old, 15 years on this job. He had the door open before the man reached the handle, not as a courtesy, as a habit. Phil knew. The 2 other researchers who had been reading at the far tables had moved even further away. No reason given. No reason needed. And the man had no phone, no laptop, just a notebook and a pen. In the current year, that was not retro. That was someone who didn't want a device tracking his location. Nora walked past his table to get the box she needed. He didn't look up. He said quietly, not changing his posture, "Box 7C has been reshelved out of order. Third shelf from the left. Someone moved sections 1940 through 1943 behind 1951 through 1955. In case it matters." She stopped. She looked at the shelf. He was right. Exactly right. No one could know that unless they had already memorized the sequence that shelf was supposed to run in, or unless they'd been in this room long enough to build their own map of it. She said, "How do you know that?" He looked up for the first time. His eyes were not cold, not hostile. They were reading her, the way you'd read a map, taking in the grid, noting what was where. He said, "I notice things that are out of place, old habit." She didn't ask anything else. She got the box. She went back to her desk. But she didn't open the box right away. She sat still for 30 seconds, her hand in her coat pocket, pressed flat against the folded map. The man who noticed things out of place had just sat in her archive for 4 hours without requesting a single document. And the map in her coat pocket, the most out-of-place thing in this entire building right now, felt heavier than it had a few minutes ago. At 9 o'clock, she made her closing round. He was still there, notebook closed, and he was watching the doorway before she stepped through it, which was unusual because Nora moved quietly and most people didn't register her approach. She said, "We close at 9. He said, "It's 8:58. She said, "You've been here 4 hours, and you haven't requested a single document." He was quiet for a moment before answering, not hesitating, choosing. Sometimes you come to a place just to remember what it used to hold. She looked at him. not with curiosity. With the particular attention of someone running information against a known grid, checking what fits and what doesn't. She said, "You knew Edmund Voss." Not a question. He didn't confirm, didn't deny. He stood, put on his coat with slow and deliberate movements, and paused at the door. "Your father was a very careful man, Miss Voss. That's a quality worth inheriting." Phil had the door open before he reached the handle. Nora stood alone in the empty reading room, one hand in her coat pocket pressing the map against her ribs. She had 34,000 documents memorized. She had no file on Callum Reyes. That was either a coincidence or a warning, and she had stopped believing in coincidences 8 months ago. She slept 3 hours. The rest of the night she sat at her kitchen table with the map spread out in front of her, trying to read what her father had left behind. His encoding system was their private language. He had started teaching her when she was 9, not as a lesson but as a game. Bedtime stories with hidden coordinates, maps that read as geography if you looked at them the usual way, but told a completely different story if you knew what to look for. She knew what to look for, and what she was reading made her hands unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. 3 names. 2 of them she recognized. One of them she wished she didn't. Senator Harlan Mast, running for governor of Illinois, a man whose smile appeared on campaign posters all over the city, a man who had been quiet and careful and permanently positioned above any kind of suspicion for more than 18 years, and her father had been mapping him the whole time. Her phone rang at 6 in the morning. Unknown number. She didn't answer. It rang again. She let it go. Third time she picked up. A man's voice, measured, unhurried. "I need to see the map, Miss Voss. Not to take it, to explain it." She said, "How did you get this number?" "The same way I know you found it last night. The same way I know you haven't slept." She looked at the window, curtains drawn. She sat still and counted to 8. Not because she was scared, because she was thinking. Then she said, "Where?" "He arrived first." Of course he did. The restaurant was small, in Pilsen, the kind of place that didn't need a sign because everyone who needed to know about it already did. Wood tables, steamed-up windows, the smell of coffee and good bread. Callum Reyes was at the corner table, back to the wall, watching the door. Not paranoid, habitual. The way some people carry their shoulders back without knowing they're doing it. When she sat down, the coffee was already there. She looked at it. He had ordered correctly without asking her. That was either extremely good intelligence or extremely good attention. And at this particular moment, she wasn't sure which one troubled her more. She said nothing about the coffee. She wrapped her hands around the cup and waited. He said, "Your father worked for me. Not officially, not on paper." She said nothing. This was not silence from shock. It was the silence of someone receiving information and running it against everything she already knew, checking for inconsistencies. He continued. He was a cartographer in every sense of the word. He mapped things that couldn't be mapped openly. Relationships, transactions, points of leverage. For 20 years he documented everything I couldn't document without putting myself or the people I protect at risk. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because someone found out what he was doing, and I don't know who. And the map is either bait, or it's what your father wanted someone to find. I need to know which one. And you think I can tell you?" Callum looked at her directly, not through her, at her. "I think you already know. I think you've known since last night." A long moment. She drank her coffee, set the cup down carefully, like she was placing a decision on the table along with it. "He built his encoding system when I was 9. Bedtime stories with hidden coordinates. It was the first real thing she gave him, not because she trusted him, because this was the only path toward understanding what her father had actually built. And this man had walked that path alongside Edmund for 15 years. She needed to know where the path went. They were mid-conversation when Nora glanced through the window. A man in a gray jacket was standing across the street. Just standing. She had seen him earlier that morning, 2 blocks from the Institute. She said, without changing her tone, The man in the gray jacket across the street. Is he yours? Callum didn't turn his head. No. Then we have about 4 minutes before this becomes a different kind of conversation. Callum stood and left cash on the table. He didn't count the bills. He already knew what was there. Back door. Left down the alley. Right on 19th. There's a green door. Go in and go up. She said. I don't know you. He was already moving. At the exit, he paused, just for a second. No, but you knew your father. And he trusted me. She sat there for 2 full seconds after he was gone. Then she stood up. The room above the restaurant was bare. A table, 2 chairs, a single window looking out over rooftops. Not an office, not a home. This was a room for meeting people when you needed to see how they handled having nothing to look at except each other. She said, What happened to the man who was following me? He checked his phone. He's being redirected. Meaning? Meaning he'll spend the next 2 hours explaining himself to someone who asks considerably better questions than either of us. She looked at him. He wasn't giving her everything. But the part he was giving her was true. Her father had spent 15 years teaching her how to read the gap between those two things. She said, I want to find out who killed my father. I know. And you want the map. I want to understand what he was trying to tell us when he made sure it survived. A pause. She looked at her hands. Then we want the same thing. She didn't trust him. She trusted the fact that Edmund Voss had trusted him, and her father had been the most careful man she had ever known. Whatever Callum Reyes was, Edmund had believed he was worth mapping. That was enough to take the next step. Just the next one. The 14th floor of an office building in the West Loop. No name on the door, no receptionist. Just a plain door with a number on it, and inside, a room that told her everything she needed to know about who Callum Reyes actually was. It wasn't what she had expected. Not expensive, not cold. There was nothing here to impress. The desk was scarred and well used, the light positioned for reading, not atmosphere. The files arranged in a system she recognized within 30 seconds as a real archival method, not decoration. Books stacked by subject, not by color. Everything organized for function, nothing organized for appearance. And on the walls, maps. Chicago through different eras. 1871, the year of the Great Fire. 1920, when the city was redrawn by Prohibition money. 1968, the year the whole country watched Chicago tear itself apart. 2010. Interspersed among them, smaller and more detailed, were others. She moved to one without thinking about it, touched the northeast corner with 2 fingertips. Her father always started in that corner. The particular angle of his pen strokes in the upper right quadrant was as recognizable to her as his handwriting. She said, That's my father's work. From his desk, Callum said, 12 years of it, he updated every quarter. He never showed me these. Callum was quiet for a moment. He was protecting you. From what? From knowing what he knew. The two things couldn't coexist. You can't know what he knew and stay safe. He chose your safety. She didn't respond. She stood looking at those maps longer than the conversation required. And something shifted in her, quietly, like a piece of furniture being moved in a dark room. Not a decision she made consciously. A reckoning she was beginning to have with herself about her father. About what it meant to love someone by not believing they were strong enough to handle the truth. She had been angry at him for 8 months. She hadn't let herself examine too closely what that anger was actually about. She let herself look at it now, just briefly. Then she put it away and got to work. She spread the map on his desk. He stood on the other side. The space between them was the professional distance of 2 people evaluating a document. She started explaining her father's encoding system. The small triangles weren't location markers, they were transaction codes. The dotted lines weren't administrative boundaries, they were indirect relationships. Different ink colors marked different time periods. The system was complex enough that any outsider would see a geographic map and nothing else. She spoke quickly and without elaborating. She didn't check to see if he was keeping up. He was keeping up. Better than that, he was already 3 steps ahead in some places, providing context before she asked for it. A name she decoded from a symbol, he already knew the corresponding history. A relationship she traced through the ink. He had the folder in hand before she finished the sentence. She said, "You organize by the same system he used." He taught me. A small thing, but it settled something she hadn't realized was unsettled. This man had known her father in a way that was genuine, not useful, genuine. They worked for 2 hours, then they worked for a third. The picture that assembled itself across the table was larger than either of them had anticipated. She said finally, "He wasn't just mapping relationships. No. He was mapping evidence. Every transaction, every meeting, every transfer, he built a record." For 20 years, Callum said, he wasn't moving. She noticed that. He was very still in a particular way that she recognized as someone processing something large without letting it show on the outside. "This isn't the evidence," she said. "This map is the guide to where the evidence actually is." He built a library. He built a bomb, she said. The word surprised her a little when it came out, but it was right. "And he left the detonator with me." The room was quiet. She looked at the map. He looked at the map. For a while, neither of them said anything. She said, "Did you know what he was building?" Callum thought before answering. Really thought, not the performance of thinking. "I knew he was documenting. I didn't know the scale of it. If I had—" He stopped. She said, "You would have stopped him. I would have been more careful with him." That was not a strategic statement. She heard what he was not saying underneath it. He had let Edmund die because he hadn't known enough to protect him. And that was the thing that had been sitting inside Callum Reyes for 8 months, taking up the space that grief usually takes up when someone doesn't let themselves call it grief. She didn't name it out loud. She just said, "There are 3 more locations on the map. I'll need 2 full days to decode them. Take whatever time you need. I'm not doing this for you." "I know." She gathered her coat. He didn't offer to walk her out. She didn't expect him to. But at the door she stopped, not turning around. "Your filing system is better organized than mine." She left before he could answer. In 11 years of working completely alone, that was the first compliment he hadn't seen coming. She spent the next 2 days working in his office. Not because she particularly wanted to, because the files she needed to cross-reference were there, and because the work was faster when they could talk in real time, and because, if she was being honest with herself, which she mostly tried to be, she was beginning to understand that her father had trusted this man for reasons that were not small. The more they worked together, the more she saw it. The way he organized information, the way he listened, the way he moved through a problem, not around it, directly through. He wasn't careful with information the way a collector was careful. He was careful with it the way her father had been careful, like it mattered not because it was powerful, but because it was true. On the second day, she decoded a location in the map's southern section and asked if he recognized the address. He went to the filing cabinet, opened the 3rd drawer from the left, counted 6 folders in, pulled one out without searching. She watched him do it. "He really did teach you." "Everything I know about how to keep things," Callum said. That was all he said, but she understood it to be something larger than a method of filing. Second morning. Nora brought food. 2 sandwiches from the corner place, set one in front of Callum the way she'd set a file on a desk. No explanation. No ceremony. He looked at the sandwich, looked at her, looked back at the map. He said, "You didn't have to." She said, "I know. Eat. You've been here since before I arrived." He ate. No verbal acknowledgement, but the way he ate, deliberately, without rushing, the way her father had always eaten, like the meal was something that deserved attention, was its own kind of response. She recognized it. She had always recognized that particular language. They worked in silence for the better part of the morning. No background noise, no conversation to fill space, no checking phones. Neither of them was uncomfortable with silence. She noticed that. The particular quality of working alongside someone who wasn't performing anything, not efficiency, not sociability, not effort, just actually working. She found herself watching him once while he was cross-referencing something in his notebook. He kept a running list of questions. Each one that got answered was crossed out. She saw the page from across the table. Most of the questions weren't crossed out. The man who supposedly knew everything was living with more open questions than anyone she had ever met. Her phone rang at 11:30. Jake. Her voice changed the moment she saw his name. She answered and became a different version of herself, not a false one, just the version that belonged to her brother. Lighter, less guarded. The version that could talk about his thesis and his girlfriend and the weekend and what they were going to order at that Polish place in Bridgeport without any of the weight that lived in the version of her that came to work. They made plans for the weekend. She hung up. When she put the phone down, her face returned to what it had been. Not coldly, just accurately. Callum, without looking up, said, "He doesn't know." Not a question. She said, "He's in his final year. He has enough going on. He'll find out eventually." Eventually isn't now. Callum looked up. He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at the maps, not reading the surface, reading the structure underneath. Your father did the same thing, protected everyone from knowing, carried it alone. Is that a warning or a comparison? An observation. It seems to run in the family. She knew he was right. That didn't mean she wanted to hear it. It meant she understood that she didn't want to hear it, which was its own kind of knowing. She went back to work. But something had shifted slightly, the way a picture shifts when you adjust the frame by just enough. By 7 that evening, they had been in the same room for 10 hours. Callum had ordered food at some point, from a Polish restaurant a few blocks over, an actual meal, not just something to fuel the work. He had known she hadn't eaten dinner properly. She hadn't asked how. The map was folded and set aside for the first time in days. There was nothing on the table between them except plates and 2 cups of coffee. He told her more about Daniel. Not the version he had told before, which was the outline, the actual version. Small things. The way his brother always let his coffee go cold before he drank it. The way he shelved his books with the spines facing in so the titles were hidden, which made finding anything in his apartment a small adventure. The way he had been completely certain he was doing the right thing and completely wrong about the risk. She listened the whole way through. When he finished, she told him about her father. Not the maps. Edmund. The man who woke up early to sketch in pencil before committing anything to ink, as though every map needed its uncertain version before it was allowed to become a certain one. The man who had called her every Sunday for 12 years and never quite found a way to say what she understood now that he had been trying to say. They were talking about people they had lost, in the specific way of people who had loved them. It was almost 9 when the room went quiet in a different way. Not working quiet, something else. She wasn't sure why she said it. Maybe 10 hours of working beside someone who never performed anything had worn down the particular kind of caution that kept her from saying true things in front of other people. Maybe it was just that the dark had come in and the city lights had come on outside, and that combination always made the walls thinner. She said, "My ex called me fat." Easy. Almost like a passing observation, like she was noting the weather. At dinner. He didn't say it exactly like that. He said he needed someone who, quote, took better care of herself. But he looked at my plate when he said it. And I understood what he meant. A pause. Just the sound of the city outside the window. I didn't order pasta for 2 years after that. I didn't even realize I'd stopped until my brother asked me about it one night and I didn't have an answer. Callum didn't respond right away. He turned from the window, slowly. Not because he didn't know what to do, because he was deciding how to do it. Then he looked at her, not reading her, looking at her, just at her, with the same quality of attention he gave to things that mattered, not things that were useful. He said, "What's his name?" "Derek Holt." "What does he do?" "Journalist, Chicago Ledger." Callum nodded once, then picked up his coffee and shifted the conversation naturally, moving them to something else, something about the third location on the map, and she went with him because that was what was needed right now. She didn't notice the way he filed that name. She didn't notice that it went into a different category than other names. She wouldn't understand what that meant for a long time. But that evening, in the quiet after they stopped working, Callum Reyes made a decision that nobody had asked him to make. Derek Holt had treated someone worth respecting as though she wasn't worth seeing. In Callum's particular understanding of the world, that was the kind of thing that did not simply continue. He had resources and means and a decade of knowing exactly which information, placed in which hands, at which moment, produced which result. He would use them accordingly. He said nothing about it. He would say nothing about it for a long time. Later, when the air between them had settled into something more honest, she asked him where he had learned to read maps. Not the encoding. The maps themselves, the real ones, the habit of looking at a page and seeing the story underneath the geography. He told her about Andrzej, an old Polish man who had run the neighborhood library in Pilsen when Callum was young, who believed that maps were the only truly honest document a civilization produced, who used to say, "Show me where a person lives, where they work, where they eat, and where they go at night, and I will show you everything about them that their words will never tell you." My father said something like that, Nora said. He quoted Andrzej often. They knew each other. I didn't know that. He came to me when Daniel disappeared. He was the only person outside my network who knew to look for me. Why? Callum was quiet for a moment. He said he'd been watching me for years, and I was the only person in this business who mapped people in order to protect them, not to use them. Was that true? Used to be cleaner than it is now. No apology in it, no bid for sympathy, just accurate. I started out trying to protect people. Then I became something people needed protection from. Your father kept mapping me anyway. For years after I became the second thing, I never understood why. Because he thought you could find your way back. Callum looked at her. He had no answer for that. Not because there wasn't one, because the answer would take longer than one evening to tell. She went home with the map under her arm, and his answer still unfinished between them. Nora arrived at the Institute on Thursday morning and knew within 60 seconds that someone had been inside the archive overnight. Nothing was taken, nothing was visibly disturbed, but one box had been opened and reseated in a way that was not quite the way she'd left it, off by a fraction. The lid set down at a slightly different angle than her habit produced. Someone had been careful, not careful enough. She stood in the basement for a moment, very still, doing the same internal math she had been doing since her father died. Not panicking, assessing. Then she called Callum. He was there in 20 minutes. The way he moved through her archives surprised her. She had expected him to take it over. He didn't. He moved through the space the way you moved through someone else's home when you had been raised with good manners. Not touching what didn't need touching, observing. Then coming back to her and telling her what he'd found, as though she were the final authority here because she was. 3 people had after-hours access last night. 2 are your colleagues with keys. The third came through the loading dock. How do you know that? The camera on the loading dock has a 14-second blind spot every hour on the hour. Whoever this was knew that. She looked at him. You mapped my building. I map every building where people I'm responsible for spend significant time. Am I someone you're responsible for? A beat. Just one. You are now. Not romantic. Stated as a fact. But there was something in the way he said it that didn't quite belong to the word responsible, and she noticed it, and she set it aside for later. To trace who had been in the archive, Callum needed to speak with a woman named Vera Santos. He asked Nora if she wanted to come along. She said yes. Vera ran a dry cleaning business on the north side. 3 locations, small and successful, operating for 17 years. She also, as became clear within the first 30 seconds of sitting across from her in the back of a restaurant in River North, knew the movements of a substantial portion of the city's less official economy. Vera looked at Nora when they sat down. Edmund's daughter, she said. Not a question. You knew my father, Nora said. Everyone who mattered knew Edmund. Vera turned to Callum. The person who came through that loading dock isn't someone small. They're working for someone who's been very quiet for a very long time and intends to stay that way. She glanced back at Nora. They're not interested in the archive. They want her. Nora said nothing. The math of that was not complicated. She was the only person in the world who could read her father's maps. She was the guide to everything Edmund Voss had built. Without her, the evidence was dispersed across 7 locations and completely unreadable. With her, it was a complete case. She was not a witness. She was the key. Walking back from the restaurant, Callum said, "There's something I need to tell you about the map." She said, "Tell me." "Your father didn't leave it in that donation box by accident. He arranged for the box to be donated after his death, specifically to Hargrove, specifically to your shift." She stopped walking. "He knew he was going to die," she said. "He knew someone was going to come for him eventually. He didn't know when, so he built a failsafe. Me. You. He trusted you to find it, to read it, and to know what to do with it. He spent 20 years keeping you out of all of this. The last thing he did was decide that you were the only one who could finish it." She stood on the sidewalk in the November wind and let that land. This was not only grief, there was something else in it, something harder to name. Her father had seen her, had trusted her, had placed the most important work of his entire life in her hands. He had just waited until he was gone to do it. "He could have destroyed everything," she said. "Yes. He chose not to. He chose you." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Callum, when this is over, when Mast is dealt with and my father's work is finished, what happens to you?" He didn't answer right away. "That's the first time you've used my name. Answer the question." "I don't know yet." Plainly, simply true. She nodded, kept walking. He stood on the sidewalk and watched her until she turned the corner. He had been cataloging her from the beginning, the way he cataloged everyone, the way she moved through her archive, the way she processed information, quickly and without announcing conclusions before they were certain, the way she said true things without preface or apology. He had a file on everyone who mattered to him. He had not opened one on her. He had been aware of that fact for several days and had not yet decided what to do about it. That evening, a message came in from one of his people. Derek Holt, journalist at the Chicago Ledger, had submitted a formal interview request to Hargrove Institute Management, an exclusive investigation piece. The party who commissioned it was a law firm that represented Senator Mast's office. Callum read the message twice. Derek Holt. The man who had looked at Nora's plate at dinner and said what he'd said. Now feeding information about her location, her schedule, and the archive's intake records to the people who had ordered her father killed. Callum put his phone in his pocket and began making the particular kind of calls that ended careers quietly, completely, and without anything that could be traced back to him. This was his oldest skill. He used it now without hesitation. They decoded the final section of the map on a Friday evening. It took 3 hours. By the end, the picture was complete. Her father had not hidden everything in one place. He had distributed it across 7 locations, 3 in Chicago, 1 in Milwaukee, and one that neither of them expected, the MIT Library in Boston. Jake's City. "He put a piece where Jake is," she said. "Yes. Jake doesn't know." "No, but whoever's looking for this will work it out eventually." The unspoken question settled between them. Did Jake need to be told? They both knew the question was there. Neither was ready to say it out loud. Not yet. Callum ordered dinner from the Polish place nearby. Real food, not working food. He had noticed she wasn't eating properly in the evenings. She hadn't asked him to notice. He had anyway. For the first time since they had started working together, the map was folded and set aside. There was nothing on the table except food and coffee, and 2 people who were out of professional reasons to look at anything except each other. He talked about Daniel again. Not the summary this time. The person. His brother had been 3 years younger and considerably smarter in certain ways that Callum had not always recognized as intelligence. Daniel had a gift for making complex things look ordinary, which was also, unfortunately, the talent that made him believe he could handle things alone. He had been building a financial case against Mast's network for almost a year. He hadn't told Callum because he was afraid Callum would shut it down. He had been right about what Callum would have done. He had been wrong about whether he needed backup. He disappeared on a Thursday in October 11 years ago. His car was found by the river. No body, no note, no explanation that the police were able to locate or were inclined to pursue very hard. "That's when you started," Nora said. "That's when I became very precise about what I would and wouldn't allow myself to not know," Callum said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she told him about her father's sketching habit, the pencil drafts before the ink, the hesitant version before the certain version. The way he used to spread a new project across the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, and she would sit across from him doing homework while he worked, and they would talk about nothing in particular, and she had not understood until he was gone how much of her sense of safety had lived inside those Sunday mornings. He loved people by documenting them, she said. It was the only language he completely trusted. Callum looked at her. He left a map for everyone he lost. My brother is on one of them. I know, I saw it. I know you did. They were quiet again. The city moved outside the window. 11 floors below, people walked home from dinner and work and events, living in the ordinary world where the last item in a donation box was always what it looked like. His phone buzzed. One of his people was in trouble. A meeting gone wrong on the south side, nothing catastrophic but requiring immediate management. He was on his feet before he had finished reading the message. She watched him work. She had expected a certain kind of person to emerge in that moment. Someone who became larger, louder, more explicitly dangerous. She had seen enough of those people in the documents she catalogued, their histories, their methods, their particular relationship to crisis. What she saw instead was someone who became very small and very precise. 2 calls, 6 sentences total. And in the middle of it, while he was still talking, he looked up at her twice. Not to check she was all right, not a monitoring look. More like the way you glance at something fixed when you need to stay calibrated. When it was handled, he stood at the window for a moment. She came to stand beside him, not touching, just there. He said, "I've been doing this alone for 11 years. It's easier alone. You make decisions faster." She said, But tonight I looked up and you were in the room, and something in the thinking became clearer." A long pause. The city went on below them, indifferent to everything happening on the 11th floor. She said, "Callum?" She had been calling him by his first name for a few days now, but she still felt the weight of it each time. "I think I understand what my father was trying to say. Not just through the map. To me, specifically." She stopped, looked for the right words. He was saying, "This is the world. Don't look away from it. And don't face it alone." Callum looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hand over hers, slowly, deliberately, the way you set something breakable on a surface, making sure of the ground before you let go. She didn't pull away. They stood looking at Chicago, the river catching the lights of the bridges, the old buildings and the new ones mixed together the way this city had always mixed things, refusing to let anything be fully replaced. Later she would think about that evening the way you think about the last warm day before winter. You don't know it's the last one until it's already passed. Marcus Webb called on a Saturday morning, said he needed to see her, said it needed to be without Callum. She went. Lincoln Park. A bench by the lake. November had settled in properly now, and the water was the color of old pewter. Webb was already there when she arrived. 58 years old and looking older. The particular tiredness of someone who had been carrying a specific weight for a specific amount of time, and whose body had started to reflect the ledger of it. He had known her father for 30 years. They had worked together, briefly, in the early years of Edmund's career, before their paths diverged. Webb had gone into urban planning consulting. Edmund had gone into cartography. They had stayed in loose contact. Webb knew who Callum was. He knew the shape of what Edmund had been doing for the last 15 years, if not the full extent of it. And he had known, 7 days before Edmund Voss was killed, that Edmund was in danger. He said all of this to her on that bench by the lake. He said it plainly, without qualification, in the voice of someone who had rehearsed this conversation with himself many times over many months. Then he said, Callum had also known. 1 week before Edmund died, Callum received a specific warning that someone in his network was being targeted. He had increased protection on 3 people. Edmund was not one of them. Nora sat with that for a long moment. Why not, she said. The intelligence indicated the threat was directed at Callum himself, not Edmund. That's what Callum has told anyone who's asked. And you want me to ask him? I want you to know, Webb said. What you do with it is your decision. She looked at him for a moment. Where did you get this information? He didn't answer quickly enough. Mr. Webb, you either knew about the threat and didn't act, or you know who issued it. Which is it? He said. It's not that simple. She stood. It is that simple. I'm going to go ask Callum directly. If what you've told me is accurate, I'll know. If you've told me this for a different reason, I'll know that too. She walked back to her car without waiting for his response. She went directly to Callum's office. She didn't call ahead. She walked through the door while Phil was still straightening up from opening it. Callum was at his desk. He looked up when she came in. He read something in her face before she spoke, the way he read most things, and she watched him make a decision in the space between her walking in and her opening her mouth. She said, Did you know someone was going to come for my father? 1 week before he died? He didn't answer immediately. 1 beat, 2, that pause, that was the answer. Tell me, she said. He told her. He laid it out plainly and without maneuvering. He had received a warning that someone in his network was at risk. He had assessed the intelligence and concluded the threat was directed at him. He had increased security on the 3 people whose exposure he deemed most significant. Edmund was not on that list because the available information did not indicate Edmund as the primary target. But he died, she said. Not you. Yes. And you've known that for 8 months. Yes. She was not screaming angry. She was the quieter and more precise kind. You let me spend a week in this room, reading my father's maps, hearing about your brother, telling you things I have never told anyone. She stopped. And the entire time, you knew you might have been able to save him. I didn't know. You knew enough to wonder, and you chose not to tell me. He didn't argue. He didn't offer the defense that was technically available, that the intelligence had been ambiguous, that reasonable people making reasonable assessments could have reached the same conclusion. He could have said those things. They were true. He didn't say them. He told her the true thing instead. I was afraid that if you knew, you would stop, and I needed you to finish the map. She looked at him. For a long moment, she just looked at him. At least that's honest, she said. One of his people came through the door at that precise moment, because life placed these things where they were most disruptive when it could. Mast was moving on Jake, not the weekend, tonight, 3 minutes. Callum moved through the problem with the same small precision she had observed before. Jake was protected before she had processed the full implications of what was happening. She stood in the middle of the room and watched him do it. He did it correctly. He did it fast. He protected her brother, the brother of the man he might have been able to save. She put on her coat. He said, Nora, Jake is safe. That's what matters right now. I should have told you. Yes. She stopped at the door, didn't turn. The map is decoded. You have everything you need. You don't need me for this anymore. That's not... Good night, Callum. She left. The door closed behind her. He stood in the office for a long time, looking at the door, looking at the map on the desk, looking at the 2 cups in the corner, one of them hers, not quite finished from the night before. He had spent 11 years knowing everything about everyone. He had known, with uncomfortable accuracy, exactly what it would cost her to hear what he'd just told her. He had told himself the mission came first. He had also known, with the same accuracy, that was not entirely true. Some things you know and choose not to act on anyway. Those are always the ones that cost the most in the end. 3 days. Nora didn't go to his office, didn't call, but she didn't stop moving either. She spent those 3 days tracing the evidence locations on her own, not to retrieve anything, to understand, to walk the territory her father had mapped and see it the way he had seen it, from the ground, at the pace of someone who knew what they were looking for. At each site she found a piece of his work, a sealed envelope in a building archive, a folder in a numbered safety deposit box, documents stored in a university library under a procedural classification so ordinary it was essentially invisible. Her father had been extraordinarily careful. Each piece alone was meaningless. Together they were a complete and irrefutable case. She stood in the MIT library in Boston for a long time. Jake was 20 minutes away, in his apartment, finishing his thesis, knowing none of this. She had been protecting him the same way Edmund had protected her, deciding for him that he wasn't equipped for the truth, carrying the weight alone because that was what you did when you loved someone. And standing in that library, she began to understand that her father had done that to her for 20 years. And she had been angry at him for it since the moment she'd understood it. And she had spent the last 8 months doing the exact same thing to her brother. She called Jake that evening. She didn't tell him everything, but she told him enough. Their father had done important and dangerous work because he believed it mattered. He had loved both of them in the only language he had fully trusted, which was the language of protection, which was not the same as the language of honesty, which had cost them all something. Jake was quiet for a long time, then he said, "Did he trust you to finish it?" "Yes." "Then finish it, Nora. That's what he's telling you." She sat with that for a while after she hung up. Jake had just said the things she had needed to hear, and she had not let herself ask anyone to say. He was 22 years old, and he had handled the truth of it better than she had expected, better than she had given him credit for. She had decided for him. He had decided for himself, and the two decisions were different. 3 days, and Callum did not look for Nora. He had made that choice deliberately. He had resources and capabilities and could have known precisely where she was at any moment. That was, in fact, how he had always operated. You tracked what mattered. You stayed informed. He chose not to. He met with Marcus Webb instead, not to confront him, to listen. Webb said, "Edmund didn't just trust you with his work. He trusted you with his daughter. That's not the same thing as telling you everything. That's him telling you what was most important." Callum said, "I let him down." "Once," Webb said. "Then you spent 8 months not letting anyone else down." A pause. "The question isn't what happened. The question is what you do now that you understand the actual cost." Callum returned to his office after that conversation and did something he had not done in 11 years. He opened a new file. He typed a name at the top, Nora Voss. He sat and looked at it for a while. Then he closed it without filling it in. Didn't delete it. Didn't add a single piece of information. Just left it empty. For the first time since Daniel died, he chose not to know someone in advance. He wanted to find out the old-fashioned way. That same evening, the final report on Derek Holt came in. Suspended from the ledger, pending an internal investigation, 3 freelance contracts withdrawn in the same week. The investigation piece on Hargrove had been quietly killed by his own editor after the editor received, through an intermediary, documentation of Holt's financial relationship with Mast's law firm. Holt's career was not merely paused, it was structurally compromised in ways that would take years to rebuild, if they could be rebuilt at all. Callum read the report without expression. Then he closed his laptop and made dinner, which he rarely did, and sat at his kitchen table and ate it slowly, which he also rarely did. He had placed certain information in certain hands at a certain time. That was all. The consequences were the natural result of the truth becoming visible. He had not fabricated anything. He had simply ensured that what was true became known. Derek Holt had looked at a woman worth respecting and told her she was the problem. Then he had sold information about her to the people who killed her father. The second of those things was a crime, The first of them was something for which the formal records offered no redress. Callum had addressed both in the same action, using the same instrument, without being asked. He would say nothing about it until the right moment. He was not sure when the right moment was. He thought he might know it when he arrived at it. Meanwhile, Mast moved. He used his political standing to file a formal request for Hargrove to hand over documents as part of what he was calling a federal investigation. This was legal. This was his method. He did not need to break into buildings when he had the authority to ask nicely, and the leverage to make that ask impossible to refuse. Callum responded with information, because that was always his response. He released preliminary documentation of Mast's connection to the archive break-in to 3 independent journalists simultaneously. Not enough to prosecute. Enough for Mast to understand that if he continued pushing, the story would become public and uncontrollable. Mast pulled back. It was temporary. The real solution still required finishing what Edmund had started, and Callum could not finish it alone. He sat in his office and looked at the empty file with Nora's name on it. He had delayed the problem. He had not solved it, and the only person who could solve it had stopped returning his calls. He could find her. He could find anyone. But finding someone and having earned the right to ask them to come back were entirely different things. He would wait. 7 days after she left, Nora walked into his office at 9 in the morning. No advance call. Phil looked at her when she came through the lobby. He opened the inner door without a word and without the particular quality of deference that had always characterized how he moved around Callum. He opened it the way you'd open a door for someone who belonged on the other side of it. That told her something. Callum was at his desk when she walked in, reading. He set the book down as she entered, with a care that had nothing to do with the book. She stood in the middle of the room and said, "2 conditions." He said, "Tell me." "First, any information that directly affects my safety or Jake's, you tell me when you have it, not after you've calculated whether it serves the objective." Agreed. "Second, when this is over, I want to know everything, not a summary, everything. What my father knew, what you know, all of it. I'll decide what I do with it." He held her gaze for a moment. Agreed. She walked further into the room. "I'm not saying I've forgiven you. I'm not asking you to. I'm saying I understand why you made the choice you made. I think you were wrong. I think you know you were wrong. Yes. That's enough to move forward." She put her coat over the back of her usual chair, sat down. "Show me where we are." They worked. Different than before. A small intentional distance maintained on both sides, but deeper too, in a way that neither of them would have been able to predict. There was nothing left to pretend about. The absence of pretending made everything faster. An hour in, Callum asked her opinion on how to approach a witness. Not a tactical question, not about the map. A judgment call, the kind that depended on reading people accurately. He didn't need her for this. He had 15 years of doing exactly this kind of thing. But he asked. She answered. He listened. He adjusted the approach based on what she said. She noticed. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. There was a book on the corner of his desk that hadn't been there before. A history of Chicago cartography from the 1970s through the 1990s, the period that covered most of her father's active career. She could see from the wear on the cover that he had been reading it seriously. He was studying her father's field, not for operational reasons, to understand Edmund. She looked at the book and didn't comment, but something in her adjusted slightly, like a door that had been almost closed, being moved a degree or two toward open. The first evidence location was a decommissioned office building on the south side. They went together to retrieve it. Mast's people were watching. They were good. Nora spotted 2 of them before Callum did, which was not something that happened to Callum typically. They moved to a side exit. Callum began directing them toward the parking structure on the adjacent block. Nora looked at the street and saw something he hadn't accounted for, a van that had been there too long, positioned at the angle that would cut off that route. She said, "Not that way. Back through the building, service corridor to the east exit, then left. He looked at her for a half second, processing. Then he changed direction without question. They reached her car in 4 minutes. Nobody followed them out. Driving back, he said, "You were right." She said, "I know." "About the exit?" "I know." A beat. Then quieter. "You would have made a good cartographer." It was not a compliment about navigation. She knew that. He was telling her something about how she thought, how she read space and movement and contingency. He was telling her it reminded him of her father, in the specific tone of voice people use when they mean to say, "That is the best thing I know how to say about a person." She looked out the window at the city going by. "My father left a handwritten note," she said. "Not in the map, separate. I found it in his apartment 3 weeks after he died. Inside a book he knew I would eventually want." Callum said nothing. He was listening the way he listened, completely, without preparing his response while she was still talking. He wrote that the most important thing he had ever mapped was the people worth protecting. He listed 3 names. She paused. "Mine, Jake's." Another pause. "Yours." The car was quiet for a moment. "He listed me," Callum said. "He listed you." She could see him processing that. The note had been written before the mistake was made, before the week when the warning came, and the wrong calculation was calculated. Edmund had listed Callum's name as someone worth protecting before any of that happened. Which meant Edmund had seen something in him that was worth protecting before the thing that nearly broke that assessment. "He wasn't saying you were perfect," Nora said. "He was saying you were worth it. The two things aren't the same." "No, they're not." She looked at him. "But I think he was right about both." They drove the rest of the way in a silence that had a different texture than the silences they had been sitting in for the past several days. This was not distance. It was the particular quiet of people who have arrived, without announcement, at the same place. They collected the remaining evidence over the following 4 days. Jake flew in with the Boston piece on Thursday. He had found it exactly where the map indicated, catalogued under a procedural code that only made sense if you understood the encoding system. He hadn't understood the system when he went looking. He had called Nora, and she had walked him through it over the phone, standing in the kitchen of Callum's office building, speaking to her brother in their father's private language for the first time since they were children. Jake arrived at Callum's office on a Thursday evening with the final piece and 3 observations. First, their father had been extraordinary. Second, this was a lot. Third, he wanted to meet Callum. Callum shook Jake's hand with the same measured quality he brought to everything, and Jake looked at him for a long moment, and then looked at Nora, and then looked back at Callum and said, "Okay," in a tone that covered a significant amount of ground. Nora raised an eyebrow. Jake said he'd wait downstairs. With all 7 pieces assembled on the desk, the full scope of what Edmund Voss had built became visible for the first time. It wasn't just a case against Mast. It was a 20-year documentation of how political power and organized money had moved through Chicago, how decisions that appeared legal had been shaped by relationships that weren't, how the surface of the city's official history corresponded to an underground draft that most people never saw. Edmund had not built this to destroy anyone. He had built it to preserve the truth, to ensure that what actually happened did not simply disappear under the weight of what powerful people preferred to say happened. Callum looked at it for a long time. Then he said, he knew where it needed to go. "Not the police," Nora said. "No. Not the press. No. Too vulnerable to the same structures he was documenting." She said, "The archive." He looked at her. The archive. She understood it completely now. The donation box, the late shift, all of it intentional. Edmund had not sent his work to the archive because it was safe. He had sent it to the archive because his daughter was there. Because she was the only person in the world who could both read the encoding and understand how to preserve what it contained. Formal historical record, academic protection, cataloged, indexed, and held under the institutional cover of a research organization. The truth, properly kept, would outlast the people who wanted it buried. That was what he had believed. That was what he had built his whole life around. Callum met with Mast on a Friday afternoon. The senator's office, not some neutral location. Callum had insisted on that. He wanted Mast to be comfortable. Comfortable people were less careful. He set a bound summary on the desk. 18 years of documentation condensed. Not all of it. Enough. He said, "This is going into a historical archive, sealed for 25 years. By then, either the landscape has changed enough that the contents no longer have operational relevance, or it matters enough that it deserves to be found." Mast looked at the document without touching it. "And if you take any action against Miss Voss, her brother, anyone in my network, anyone at Hargrove Institute, or anyone who has been involved in this work, all of it goes public, not to one journalist, to 8, simultaneously, with complete documentation of provenance." Callum paused. "Tomorrow morning." "You'd be exposing yourself." Edmund Voss spent 20 years building something designed to protect people. I am in the business of honoring that. What I expose doesn't matter as much as what I protect. He meant it. He was aware that he meant it. For most of his career, what he exposed and what he protected had been perfectly balanced in a calculation that kept him safe. He was no longer certain that calculation was the right one to be making. Mast sat for a very long time. Then he stood up and left the room. He did not speak to Callum again. Callum came to the archive that night with 2 coffees. No advance call. Phil nodded him through, and there was something different in that nod, something that had shifted in the last few weeks, which Callum noticed and understood the significance of more than he showed. Nora was at her desk. She looked up when he came in. He handed her the coffee and said, "It's over. Mast won't move. The archive is safe. The materials are secure," she said. "And you?" He sat down in the chair across from her, told her plainly what he had said to Mast. All of it, including the last part. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "You meant it." "Yes." "All of it, including the part about exposure." "Yes." "That's different from how you operated before." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "My father was right about you." He didn't respond to that directly. He held the coffee cup and looked at the rows of shelves behind her desk, 34,000 documents arranged in the system she had built and maintained, and knew the way most people knew their own homes. Then she stood up and went to a shelf at the back of the room. She came back with a small box. Acid-free archival container, plain white, the same kind she used for primary sources. She set it on the desk in front of him. "There's one more thing my father left. Not in the map, not in the note, inside the archive itself. Catalogued under my employee number, flagged for my attention. I found it when I was cataloging the donation materials last week." He looked at the box. "What is it?" "His journals. 20 years. Everything he thought but didn't encode into maps." She slid it toward him. "He cataloged it with your access permissions, not mine. He knew you would be here." Callum looked at the box for a long time without touching it. "He mapped everything," he said. "Everything worth keeping." They stayed in the archive for another hour, not working. Just there, in the space where the work had been done, with the night outside and the city going on in its ordinary way, indifferent to everything that had just been settled in this building. At some point, Callum said, "What do you want? After all of this?" She said, "After meaning what?" "After tonight, after the archive, after the map, after everything." She thought about it genuinely. "I want to keep doing what I do, cataloging things, understanding patterns, finding what people leave behind." She looked at him. "You?" He had not answered that question for himself in a long time. The honest version of the answer was that he wanted to stop building his entire sense of safety on knowing everything in advance. He wanted to try not knowing how something turned out before it turned out. He said, "I want to stop knowing everything about everyone. I want to start not knowing what comes next and find out." "That sounds genuinely terrifying for you." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. "There's a research consultation position at the Institute. Someone who can read patterns in historical documentation and connect them to present-day behavior. It involves a lot of very old paper and very inconsistent cataloging systems and long days with imperfect information. He said, "That sounds manageable. The pay is terrible. I don't need the money." "I know." A pause. "Are you offering me a job, Miss Voss?" "I'm offering you a reason to show up somewhere every day where someone will notice if you don't." He came around the desk toward her, slowly, the way he always moved when the thing at stake was actual rather than operational. He put his hand against her face, light, with his fingertips, the way she touched the maps, making sure of the ground before committing to it. She didn't move away. "I'll show up," he said. In 11 years, he had mapped everything worth knowing about this city. He had not mapped this. He was, for the first time since he was very young, in territory that no one had charted in advance. He found, to his own genuine surprise, that he did not want it any other way. 6 months later. The archive was still the archive. The fluorescent lights still hummed their two-note hum. The shelves still ran floor to ceiling, 34,000 documents arranged in the system that Nora had built over 6 years and understood better than anyone. There was a second desk now, against the east wall, under the window that caught the afternoon light. A notebook, a pen, a cup of coffee that had been hot recently. Callum's desk. He was not a Hargrove employee. That arrangement would have required a different kind of story than the one this was. But he was here on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday afternoons, working on the project that he and Nora had begun together over the winter. A comprehensive historical collection tracking how Chicago had changed across eras. Not an exposé, not a case file, a record. The kind of thing that outlasted the people who tried to shape history by erasing parts of it. It was, in its way, what Edmund Voss had been building his whole life. They were continuing it. More openly, with better support structures, and with considerably less likelihood of anyone dying for it. Jake came home for a long weekend in April. He met Callum properly for the first time. The first time with actual introductions, rather than the Thursday evening in January, when Jake had arrived with evidence and said okay, and gone to wait downstairs. They had dinner together, the three of them, at the Polish restaurant in Bridgeport that Edmund had taken his children to every year on their birthdays. Afterward, walking back to her apartment, Jake said to Nora, "He's kind of terrifying." Nora said, "He's kind of everything." Jake was quiet for half a block. Then he said, "Dad would have liked him." Nora didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth of it was obvious to both of them, in a way that required no confirmation. Phil retired at the end of March. His replacement was a young man named Tony, who was excellent at the job, and who would, in time, develop his own instincts about when to have the inner door open before someone reached it. Before he left, Phil stopped by the archive on his last day. He shook hands with Callum, and the handshake was not what it had been in the beginning, that first week when Phil had moved with the careful awareness of someone in proximity to power. This was a handshake between two men of similar age who had both been at the same institution long enough to have earned a plain acknowledgement of each other. That was Callum's actual change, Nora thought, watching it. Not any single decision or statement or gesture, the accumulation of days, the slow shift from a man who existed in rooms as a force to be reckoned with toward a man who existed in rooms as a person. It was not a dramatic transformation. It was the kind that happened in the ordinary course of showing up somewhere regularly and letting the place make its small marks on you. The last thing. It was a Tuesday evening in late April. The archive had been officially closed for 20 minutes. Nora was doing her closing round, moving through the stacks, turning off lights row by row, the same route every night, the same quiet ritual that bookended the days. Callum was by the main door, coat over his arm, waiting. She had noticed over the past several months that he was good at waiting. Not impatient waiting, not the strategic waiting of someone calculating the right moment to act. Just ordinary waiting, the kind that said, "I'm here and there's no particular rush." That was also new. She had filed it under the same category as the book about Chicago cartography and the empty file with her name on it. She got the last light. The archive went dark around her, familiar dark, the dark of a room she had been walking through for 6 years. She moved toward the door by memory. Her memory, her space. He held the door. She said, "Ready?" He said, "Ready." They walked out. The door closed behind them. The archive held its 34,000 documents in the dark, along with everything Edmund Voss had spent his life documenting, and the sealed box in the restricted access section, and the quiet of a building at the end of its day. Her father had spent 20 years mapping what mattered. She understood now what he had been working toward. Not an archive of damage, not a weapon to be deployed at the right political moment. A record of what was worth protecting. The truth of a city, preserved because someone believed it deserved to survive the people who wanted to bury it. She had his hands, his habit of attention, his faith that the right things, properly kept, would outlast the wrong ones. That history remembered what power preferred to forget, if you gave it somewhere to live. She carried that forward. She carried it alongside someone who had spent 11 years knowing everything about everyone, and was learning, one day at a time, that the things most worth knowing were the ones you allowed yourself not to know in advance. Who was discovering, in his own way, that the point of the map was not to eliminate the uncertainty of the journey. It was to give you enough of a foundation that the uncertainty became something you could walk into, rather than something you had to brace against. The archive held 34,000 documents. It held her father's work. It held a sealed box with restricted access containing everything Callum Reyes had done and survived and would answer for in the fullness of time. And it held, in no catalog and no classification and no acid-free archival container, the particular quiet that settles into a room when two people have stopped performing and started simply being. That, too, was worth keeping. That, too, was the cartographer's daughter's work. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.
This story was never really about maps, and it was never really about the Mafia. It was about something much more personal than that. Something most of us have felt at least once in some version of our own lives. It was about what happens when someone reduces you to a single sentence. When a person who is supposed to see you really see you looks at you instead and finds you lacking. And how quietly, how completely that sentence can rewrite the way you move through the world afterward. Nora didn't scream. She didn't fight back. She simply got smaller, changed what she ordered at restaurants, took up less space, told herself she was being practical. What she was actually doing was carrying someone else's cruelty as though it were her own truth. That is the first lesson. Other people's smallness is not your measurement. The second lesson belongs to Callum. He built an empire on knowing everything. Because the one time he didn't know enough, he lost the person he loved most. His response to grief was control. His response to vulnerability was information. And for 11 years, that worked. Until he met someone he chose not to build a file on. Until he decided for the first time that some things were worth discovering the slow way. That is the second lesson. The strongest thing you can do for someone is choose not to control them. And the third lesson is Edmund's, a man who spent 20 years protecting his daughter by keeping her in the dark, and whose final act was to trust her completely with everything he had built. He was wrong for 20 years. He was right at the end. And the combination of those two things is what made his legacy real. That is the third lesson. It is never too late to finally say, I trust you. I believe in you. Here is everything. Finish what I started. 3 people, 3 wounds, 3 ways of learning the same truth. Real strength is not the absence of vulnerability. Real strength is what you build after you stop pretending you don't have any.